first time that my Filipino aunt told me that I should stop doing art, I cried. Society seems to have this grudge against everything that I love. People like my aunt have told me that I should stop trying to be an artist. I've been shushed inside of the car for singing too loudly. And of course, I grew up with the idea of the starving artist. So people have told me that I should just give up art now and take up something else like calculus. Now, the thing is, art isn't just a hobby for me. Art is necessary for my health and well-being. Without art, I would constantly be stressed out, only living so that I can fill out homework assignments and study for tests. Now, comics have really become my emotional outlet. And my comics have really brought me to totally new places. Now, I'm part of this organization called the Youth Arts Collectives, which is basically a big clubhouse/art studio for teenagers. And they're given all the art supplies they would ever want, and they get to make their own individual projects. Now, the Youth Arts Collective gave students a challenge during the month of February to make 30 drawings in 30 days. So naturally, I made 30 comics in 30 days. My series was called College and Prep because I wanted it to be a series about my own college anxieties and high school musings. Now, these comics have really brought me to new places because now I'm actually working with one of the mentors at YAC, a professional cartoonist, to make this series into a little book. Now, there are a lot of things that I've learned from making this series, but the biggest thing that I learned is that comics are an underappreciated art form. And I hope that you all will realize this today. Now, when you think of comics, you might remember yourself as a teenager, reading through color-saturated pictures of violent vigilantes fighting villains. Or maybe you remember yourself as a little kid, flipping through huge volumes of Calvin and Hobbes or the Peanuts. Us millennials might read through the newest posts on cyanide and happiness, or hyperbole and a half. And adults might read through the editorial pages and look at the political comments. Now, the thing is, a lot of people think that comics are only for kids and immature adults. But that's totally not true. Comics can be just as insightful as one of Picasso's greatest paintings or one of the greatest American novels. Comics are one of the highest forms of art. Now, this is how I realized this. Comics have been a big part of my life. I still have tons and tons of pages of graphic novel ideas that I've either stuffed inside of forgotten folders or that I've thrown inside of the recycling bin. If you go back even further, I used to ask my relatives if they would pay for little strips of paper that had little comics on them. My sales total, $0.00. But that doesn't mean that I didn't learn anything from this developing stage of my comic making, though, because comics have honestly become part of my identity. Now, this is why I think that comics have been so insightful to me and many other people. If you have a kid at home, you might and should read to them at night. Now, when you read to them, their books aren't just filled with words. They're filled with pictures and words, which is why they're called picture books. So ever since we were raised, we've been raised with a synthesis of words and pictures. So when I see a picture of a cat when I was little, I would associate it with the word cat. Now, this isn't just exclusive to kids. Adults love books with pictures. Admit it, you do. Take any classical novel and add pictures to it, and it immediately becomes better. Yeah, now you see what I mean. Now, here's another theory of why I think this synthesis of pictures and words is so effective. Originally, and words were the same thing. So if you look at ancient hieroglyphs, they were basically a bunch of pictures strung together to make a story. If you look at the ancient ruins of Chichen Itza and other Mayan temples, the stories that are etched inside of the stone walls are really just really, really long comics, chronicling the stories of Mayan emperors and farmers' almanacs. Now what you're seeing over is the ancient Babylonian number 4. Now, each one of the little sticks that you see was originally a picture of a wheat stalk. So at first, Babylonian wheat stalks were used as sort of tally marks to count the number of wheat that the Babylonians had every single year. But these pictures eventually translated, they evolved into their number system. Now, you can see this in the etymology of many of our English letters. Take this, for example. This is a letter that I don't see very much. It's the letter A. Now, if you go back 1,200 years ago, this is what A looked like. It was sideways. Now, you might not see it yet. Let's go back even further, back to the ancient Egyptian hieroglyph that the A was based off of. Originally, the A was a picture of a bull, or in ancient Egyptian, an aleph. So many of our English letters, if you go back in time, were originally pictures. And really, when you're reading, you're looking at a bunch of pictures strung together to make stories and ideas. Now, if you look at history, you'll see that this synthesis of words and pictures have diverged. They've become two totally separate mediums, art and literature. But what comics aim to do is get these two worlds and link them back together again in completely unique ways. Comics are absolutely revolutionary. Now, a lot of people have been giving me suggestions for a lot of different graphic novels that I should read. Mostly my friends, librarians, and admittedly hours of Wikipedia. But the thing that I've learned from these comics is that comics really are a forgotten art form. Here's one of those comics that I read. It was Watchmen. Basically, it was a story of superheroes who have to deal with a society that views superheroes very, very differently. Now, the interesting thing about Watchmen is that if you look at one single panel, there are literally 3 stories happening all at the same time in one moment. You can't have that in any other medium. If you had it in literature, you would have to read through each of the moments sequentially. And if it were a piece of art, it would only be capturing one moment. It wouldn't be able to capture 3 stories happening all at the same time. So Watchmen was a completely revolutionary comic book that changed the way that a lot of people viewed comic books. In fact, many critics put Watchmen as one of the top 100 best American novels. Not graphic novel, novel. Here's another example. So you might have heard of anthropomorphism, which is giving human attributes to things that are other than human, like animals or objects. But Mouse, one of the graphic novels that I read, was the first time that I saw anthropomorphism the other way around. So the artist, Art Spiegelman, wanted to tell the story of his father's experiences during the Holocaust. Now, the interesting thing is, Spiegelman decided to make the Jews mice and the Nazis cats. Now, this almost sounds satirical, like he's making fun of the Holocaust, but the thing is he's doing the complete opposite. By making these characters less human, he more deeply humanicizes the story. He does this in 2 ways. For one, by making very simple characters, he's able to leave much of the horror that the Jews experienced during the Holocaust to the imagination. Because what Spiegelman realized is that no matter how realistic he made his drawings, it could never convey what the Jews experienced. Now, the second interesting thing is that by making these characters very simply, he made the characters more down-to-earth and relatable. Now, this is how this makes sense. Have a look at these 2 pictures. Now, one of them is realistic, and one of them is a cartoon. But if I asked you which one was a comic, you'd probably say the one that looks a lot simpler. But the thing is, neither of these are comics. Now it is. Now, the difference between these 2 faces is that they represent 2 different styles of comics, realistic and cartoon, and they're used in completely different ways. Now, when you draw a realistic drawing, you aim to get the details of one specific person, and it's only supposed to represent one single person. Now, when you have a face that doesn't have as many details, if it's just a circle with 2 dots and a smile, it doesn't represent one single person because it has very few details. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't represent no one. In fact, it represents everyone, the entirety of humanity. The idea behind very simple comics is to get the audience's emotions and identities and pour it into this very, very simply drawn character. Now you can see this in a lot of very famous cartoons. Tintin, Calvin from Calvin and Hobbes, and Charlie Brown from the Peanuts, all of these characters are drawn very simply so that audiences can get their own emotions and identities and pour it into these characters. And in this way, comics are relatable to the entire audience. Now, you've seen this characterization of me scuttling across the screen. He has a hard time holding on to papers because his hands are stubs. He doesn't judge people by how they smell because he doesn't have a nose. And his mouth is in a Schrödinger-esque state of existence and non-existence. Now, the reason why I made this character very simply, without as many details, even taking away his nose and his mouth, is because I wanted to make this character very, very relatable. And I get that compliment a lot for my comics, that they're very, very relatable. And I think that that's part of the reason why they're relatable. Because I made a very simply drawn characterization of me that other people can funnel their own identities into and realize their own emotional turmoils that I also have. Comics aren't just everyone else's emotional outlet, they're mine as well. Now, I normally complain about high school and college anxieties, but every once in a while I'll complain about my parents or the amount of homework that I have. But there are a few rules that I try to keep for myself when I draw these comics. Number one, draw what I care about, or don't care about. Normally, I will complain about things like myself, but sometimes I'll complain about homework. Now, number two, not necessarily say things that people haven't thought of yet, but things that people have been thinking about but don't want to say. If you've ever talked to me by myself, then you'll know that I'm the person who says what everyone else is thinking about but don't want to say. Here's an example of that. Now, number three, maintain something called self-schadenfreude. You might have heard of schadenfreude, which is basically laughing at the pain of other people, but self-schadenfreude is laughing at your own pain. This is an illustration of one of those comics. And what I try to aim to do with these comics is let other people realize their own pains and laugh at them the same way that I've laughed at my own pains. Number four, make sure that I don't post anything that I'll immediately regret 20 years from now. This talk is pushing it a little. Now, comics have honestly become part of my identity. I've seriously had full conversations with people who I've never talked to just because they recognized me as the comic guy. And I think that that's the magic of the internet. By posting my comics on Facebook and other social medias, I've been able to communicate not only to people who are across the world who I've never been able to talk to, but people who I'm not socially in contact with. By creating this art and posting it on the internet, I'm able to talk to people who I wouldn't otherwise be able to communicate these deep and meaningful topics. In this way, comics are all about communication. And I think that communication, along with art, is what separates us from a lot of different animals in the animal kingdom. Now, as you heard, I'm a volunteer at the Monterey Bay Aquarium, so I can't get through 10 minutes without talking about the Monterey Bay Aquarium. So one thing that I've learned from biology is that humans and animals are very, very alike. And there are a lot of things that animals do that us humans can't do. For example, octopuses have 9 brains, and they can open a jar better than I can. Now, sea otters actually use tools in order to pry their food off of rocks and also break open their shells so that they can get the soft innards. Now, that means that we're not the only animals that use tools in order to obtain things and to get things done. And if you thought that humans were the only animals that had self-consciousness, we're not. We're starting to find that a lot of chimpanzees seem to have the same self-consciousness as humans do. But what I think separates us from other animals is that us humans can communicate ideas and stories through art and disperse them throughout generations. In the simplest sense, I think everyone in this audience is an artist. Whether you were doodling while I was giving this presentation, and that's perfectly fine, or you were humming on your way to your car, or you have this very specific way of drawing your signature every single time that you sign a piece of paper. In all of these ways, you too are an artist. Comics especially are the one art form that's for everyone. Whether you're a kid who's reading a picture book, or you're a teenager reading through Superman for the first time, or you're an adult wondering where his hair all went, reading through the Sunday funnies and political comics. Comics are one of the best ways of communicating the human experience. Thank you.